Have you ever felt like you're working hard, but your life isn't really moving forward? Like every day looks almost the same as the one before it? You wake up, you work, you deal with responsibilities, and somehow the future still feels distant, almost out of reach. A lot of people think the problem is a lack of opportunity. But what if the real reason is something much quieter than that? What if the difference between a life that stays the same and a life that transforms comes down to how you use the first hour of your day? In this story, you'll meet a struggling man whose life looked stuck in an endless cycle, long hours of work, little progress, and the growing feeling that nothing would ever change, until one simple decision began to reshape everything. A habit so small most people ignore it, yet powerful enough to change his entire future. This isn't a story about luck, talent, or sudden success. It's about something far more practical and far more accessible. A quiet habit that slowly turns knowledge into opportunity. And by the end of this story, you might start looking at your mornings very differently. Most people don't wake up one morning and decide to live a small life. It happens quietly, almost invisibly. Days begin to repeat themselves, one after another, like pages of a book that never changes. Work, rest, worry, sleep, and then the same story again tomorrow. After a while, many start believing this rhythm is simply how life is meant to be. Look around and you'll notice something interesting. Millions of people are working hard every single day. They wake up early, they push through long hours, they carry responsibilities on tired shoulders. And yet, despite all that effort, their lives barely move forward. Not because they lack effort, but because something else is missing. You see, effort without new knowledge often keeps a person running in circles. It's like walking down the same road every day, hoping somehow it leads somewhere new. The steps feel productive, the sweat feels meaningful, but the destination never changes. And slowly, that quiet frustration begins to grow. Many people never realize the invisible wall standing in front of them. It isn't made of money, luck, or opportunity. More often, it's made of limited information. If someone only knows a few paths, they can only walk a few paths. And so life becomes a loop they don't know how to escape. Think about it for a moment. A person can work for 10 years and still feel like they're standing in the same place. Not because they're lazy or incapable, but because no one ever showed them a different way to think, learn, or grow. Without new knowledge, the future often looks exactly like the past. Over time, this creates a dangerous belief, a quiet thought that whispers inside people's minds. Maybe this is just my life. Maybe improvement is only for other people. Maybe circumstances can't really change. And when someone begins believing that, something inside them slowly dims. Dreams shrink, curiosity fades. Hope becomes quieter with every passing year. But every once in a while, someone discovers something unexpected. A small idea, a new piece of knowledge, a different way of using time. And that tiny discovery can begin to crack the invisible walls surrounding their life. Because soon, one struggling man is about to realize something that will change everything. In a quiet corner of a busy city lived a man most people never noticed. He wasn't famous, he wasn't powerful, and his name rarely appeared in anyone's plans or conversations. Each morning, long before the streets became crowded, he was already awake, not because he wanted to be, but because life demanded it. Bills, responsibilities, and survival had a way of pulling him out of bed before the sun. His days were long and heavy with routine. He worked wherever work could be found, loading trucks, cleaning warehouses, fixing whatever needed fixing. The kind of work that leaves your hands rough and your back aching before lunchtime. By evening, exhaustion clung to him like dust after a long road. Still, he kept going, because stopping wasn't really an option. People often assume effort guarantees progress. But this man knew something many quietly experience. You can work harder than everyone around you, and still feel like life isn't moving. Each paycheck disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. And the future? It looked suspiciously like the present. Sometimes, during short breaks, he'd watch other people passing by. Office workers carrying laptops, students laughing about exams and plans, business owners speaking confidently on their phones. And he'd wonder, how did their lives take a different road than his? It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was more like a quiet confusion. He had discipline, he had determination, and he wasn't afraid of hard work. Yet something important seemed just out of reach, like there was a door somewhere, but he didn't know where to find it. At night, when the world slowed down, his thoughts grew louder. He'd sit alone with the strange feeling that life was happening somewhere else, not far away, just on the other side of something invisible. But invisible walls are the hardest ones to break, especially when you don't know they exist. Still, deep down, a small spark remained alive inside him. A stubborn voice that refused to disappear, a voice that whispered, there must be another way. He didn't know where that way was, but soon something would force him to confront the truth about the life he was living. Because the hardest part wasn't the work, it was the growing feeling that tomorrow might look exactly like today. At first, the routine didn't seem dangerous. Wake up early, work hard, return home tired, repeat tomorrow. It felt responsible, even honorable in a way. After all, this is what many people are taught life should look like. But slowly, something began to feel off. Days started blending together like identical photographs. Monday looked like Tuesday. Tuesday looked like Thursday. Weeks passed without a single moment that truly felt different. Nothing terrible happened, but nothing meaningful changed either, and that quiet sameness began to weigh on him. He noticed it in small moments. The same streets he walked every morning. The same conversations repeating at work. The same tired silence waiting for him at night. Life wasn't falling apart, but it also wasn't moving forward. Sometimes he would pause and ask himself a simple question. If I keep living exactly like this, where will I be in 5 years? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was actually much more unsettling than that. The answer was exactly where he already was. That realization crept into his mind more often than he liked. While carrying heavy boxes, while waiting for the bus, while staring at the ceiling at night, it followed him quietly, like a shadow that never left. And the more he noticed it, the harder it became to ignore. The routine that once felt normal now felt like a cage. What made it worse was the feeling of powerlessness. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't lazy, and he wasn't wasting his time. In fact, he was doing exactly what society told him to do: work hard and stay responsible. Yet somehow the results never seemed to change, and that contradiction confused him deeply. Many people experience this moment in life. It's not loud, dramatic, or explosive. It's quiet and slow, like realizing the road you're walking doesn't lead anywhere new. And when that awareness appears, it can either paralyze you or wake you up. But first, something has to break the illusion. For this man, that moment was closer than he realized. A moment that would force him to stop pretending everything was fine. A moment that would reveal a painful truth about the direction of his life. And once he saw that truth clearly, there would be no way to go back to living the same way. Sometimes life changes slowly, and sometimes it hits you all at once. For this man, the moment arrived on an ordinary evening that felt strangely heavier than the others. Nothing dramatic happened on the outside, but inside, something finally refused to stay silent. He sat alone after another long day of work. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of an old lamp. His body was exhausted, but his mind wouldn't rest. Thoughts kept circling the same uncomfortable question. Where is all of this effort actually leading? For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine the future honestly. Not the hopeful version he told himself to stay motivated, the realistic one. If nothing changed, the same job, the same financial stress, the same exhausting routine, year after year, stretching forward like an endless road. And suddenly the truth felt impossible to ignore. Hard work alone wasn't changing his direction. He wasn't climbing a ladder. He was walking on a treadmill, moving constantly, but never going anywhere new. That realization landed heavily on his chest. It wasn't anger or self-pity that filled the room. It was something deeper and more uncomfortable. The understanding that time doesn't wait for people to figure things out. Every year that passes quietly becomes part of a life story. He thought about the next 5 years, then the next 10. Would he still be here, living the same days again and again, still wondering why nothing ever improved? The idea felt heavier than all the work he carried each day. Moments like this are uncomfortable, but they're also powerful. Because when someone finally sees the truth clearly, they can no longer hide behind the illusion that things will magically improve. Reality becomes a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. That night, something shifted inside him. He realized waiting for opportunity had kept him stuck. Maybe opportunity wasn't something that arrived. Maybe it was something a person had to build. And if that was true, then the next decision he made would matter more than any before it. Because the following morning, before the sun even appeared, He would try something he had never truly committed to before. The next morning arrived quietly, just like every other morning before it. The streets outside were still dark, and the city hadn't begun its daily noise. But inside that small room, something was different. The man woke up earlier than usual, not because he had to work, but because he had made a decision. A small one, perhaps, but sometimes the smallest decisions carry the greatest weight. He sat at the edge of his bed for a moment, feeling the heaviness of sleep still pulling at him. Part of him whispered that he should rest a little longer. After all, he had another long day of work waiting for him. But the thought from the night before returned, clear and stubborn. If nothing changed, then nothing would ever change. So instead of lying back down, he stood up. The room was quiet, almost peaceful in a way he had never noticed before. For the first time, the early morning felt like unused space in the day. Time that usually disappeared into sleep. Time that could now belong to something else. He didn't have a perfect plan. No expensive courses, no grand strategy, no mentor guiding him step by step. All he had was a simple idea. Before the world wakes up, I will learn something new. Even if it's just a few pages, a few notes, a few new thoughts. That morning he opened an old book he had barely touched before. The pages smelled faintly of dust and paper. At first, the words felt slow and unfamiliar, like muscles being used for the first time. But he kept reading, line by line, because something inside him knew this moment mattered. You see, change rarely begins with dramatic gestures. More often it starts with quiet discipline. An extra 30 minutes. One chapter read before sunrise. One idea learned before the world starts rushing again. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen nothing remarkable. Just a tired man sitting with a book while the sky slowly turned gray. But inside that simple moment, a new direction was beginning to form. And soon, he would discover something that would completely change how he saw knowledge itself. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More 2 Bonus for you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. At first, those early mornings felt like walking through unfamiliar territory. The man would sit quietly with his books, sometimes rereading the same page twice. Some ideas made sense immediately. Others felt confusing, almost distant, like a language he was still learning to hear. But little by little, something inside his mind began to shift. One morning, while reading a passage about learning and personal growth, he stumbled upon a simple idea. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet sentence tucked between other words. It said that knowledge, when applied consistently, can change the direction of a person's life. And that thought stayed with him long after he closed the book. Later that week, he heard a similar message again. This time from a short interview he listened to during his commute. A successful entrepreneur was describing how his life changed after he began studying every morning. Not because he was naturally talented, but because knowledge slowly expanded the choices available to him. That idea fascinated the man. It suggested something he had never fully considered before. Maybe people didn't escape difficult situations through luck alone. Maybe they simply learned things others hadn't learned yet. And those new ideas quietly opened doors that once seemed invisible. The more he thought about it, the more the pattern made sense. Doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, skilled workers, all of them had one thing in common. At some point in their lives, they had invested deeply in learning. Knowledge had become their most valuable tool, and suddenly, the man realized something powerful. He didn't need to change everything overnight. He didn't need to be the smartest person in the room. He simply needed to keep learning, one small step at a time, day after day, idea after idea. This discovery changed the way he looked at those quiet mornings. They were no longer just moments of reading. They were investments in a future he was slowly building. Each page carried the possibility of a new skill, a new way of thinking, or a new opportunity he had never seen before. And with that realization, his mornings began to take on a new purpose. Because if knowledge truly had the power to reshape a life, then the next question became obvious. How could he turn these early moments of study into a system strong enough to change his future? Once the idea settled in his mind, the man understood something important. Reading randomly whenever he felt inspired wouldn't be enough. If knowledge was truly powerful, it deserved structure and consistency. So those quiet mornings began to change shape. They slowly became something more intentional. Instead of opening any book he found nearby, he started choosing carefully. One week focused on practical skills, communication, problem solving, decision making. Another week he explored stories of people who had transformed their lives. Sometimes he wrote down ideas that struck him deeply. Other times he simply paused and thought about how those lessons applied to his own life. Soon the early hours followed a rhythm. Wake up before sunrise, prepare a simple cup of coffee, sit in silence while the world outside was still asleep, and then spend that sacred hour feeding his mind. He didn't rush through pages anymore. He treated each idea like a tool being added to a toolbox. When he learned something useful, he asked himself a simple question: how could I use this today? That question turned knowledge into action. Some mornings he practiced small changes immediately: a better way to organize his work tasks, a new way to speak confidently with co-workers, a habit of writing down ideas before they disappeared. Little adjustments that seemed small, but began building momentum. This is where many people give up, by the way. Consistency feels boring at first. There are no fireworks, no instant rewards, just quiet repetition while the rest of the world is still sleeping. But that's exactly what makes the habit powerful. Day after day, his mind became sharper. Problems that once confused him started making more sense. Conversations at work felt easier to navigate. He began noticing opportunities that had always been there, but that he had never recognized before. Still, transformation doesn't happen without resistance, because while the system was becoming stronger, something else was beginning to push back. Fatigue, doubt, and temptation were waiting quietly in the shadows of those early mornings. For a while, the new routine felt exciting. There was a sense of purpose in those early hours before sunrise. But enthusiasm, as many people discover, doesn't last forever. Soon enough, the mornings became harder than he expected, much harder than reading about success stories made them sound. Some days the alarm rang while the sky was still black. His body felt heavy, as if sleep were pulling him back down. The bed felt warm, comfortable, safe, and the thought crossed his mind more than once: maybe skipping just one morning wouldn't matter. Fatigue became his first real opponent. After long days of physical work, waking up early wasn't easy. There were mornings when his eyes struggled to stay open while reading, moments when the words on the page blurred together, and doubts began whispering quietly in the background. What if this doesn't change anything? What if all this effort leads nowhere? Questions like that tend to appear right when discipline is being tested. They creep into the mind slowly, trying to weaken commitment, and many people give up right there. But the man remembered the night that changed everything. The night he saw clearly where his old routine would lead. Going back to that life suddenly felt more painful than waking up early. So even when the mornings were uncomfortable, he kept showing up. Not perfectly. Some days he read slowly. Some days he barely managed a few pages before work. But he learned something powerful during those difficult weeks. Consistency doesn't mean perfection. Sometimes consistency simply means refusing to stop, even when progress feels invisible, even when motivation disappears, even when no one else sees the effort you're making. You keep moving forward, and slowly, almost too quietly to notice, something began changing. The ideas he read started connecting together. Concepts that once felt abstract now made practical sense. And before long, those quiet hours of learning would produce the first sign that his life was truly beginning to shift. Weeks passed, and something subtle began to change. Not in his circumstances yet, but in the way he thought. The ideas he read each morning started connecting like pieces of a puzzle. Concepts that once felt distant now felt practical and usable. And slowly, his mind began to see the world differently. At work, he noticed things he had never paid attention to before. Small inefficiencies in the way tasks were organized, better ways to communicate with co-workers, smarter ways to approach problems instead of simply reacting to them. Knowledge was quietly sharpening his awareness. The transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. No one suddenly congratulated him. No opportunity appeared overnight. But inside, something powerful was happening. He was becoming someone who thought differently. Confidence began to grow in small, quiet ways. He spoke a little more clearly during conversations. He asked better questions when something didn't make sense. He even began suggesting small improvements at work, things he would have been too unsure to say before. You see, knowledge has an interesting effect on the mind. The more you understand, the more possibilities you begin to notice. Situations that once looked like obstacles start looking like problems waiting to be solved. And when you solve problems, people start paying attention. The man didn't realize it at first, but others were slowly noticing the difference. His supervisors trusted him with slightly more responsibility. Co-workers began asking for his opinion on certain tasks, little signs that something about him had changed. All of this came from those quiet hours before sunrise. Page after page, idea after idea, morning after morning when no one else was watching. The progress was slow, but it was real. And eventually, slow progress leads to something important. A moment when all those invisible efforts finally reveal themselves. A moment when the world outside begins to notice what has been growing quietly inside. For this man, that moment was closer than he imagined. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. Not a dramatic miracle, not a sudden stroke of luck, just a small moment that most people might have overlooked. But for this man, it meant everything, because it proved his quiet effort had started changing reality. At work, a problem appeared that had been frustrating the team for days. The usual solutions weren't working, and people were beginning to grow impatient. Machines stopped, tasks slowed down, and tension filled the room. Normally, he would have stayed silent and continued doing his part. But this time, something felt different. He remembered an idea he had studied weeks earlier, a simple principle about breaking problems into smaller steps. Instead of reacting quickly, he paused and observed carefully. Then he suggested a small adjustment to the process. Nothing complicated, just a smarter way to approach the issue. At first, people weren't sure what to think. After all, he wasn't the most experienced person in the room. But someone decided to try the idea anyway. And slowly, the problem began to untangle itself. The solution worked. The change wasn't loud, but it was noticeable. Tasks started moving again. The tension in the room faded, and a few co-workers looked at him with quiet surprise. Where had that idea come from? Later that day, a supervisor approached him. It wasn't a long conversation, just a few simple words. But the tone carried something new. Respect. For the first time, his thinking had been recognized. Not just his labor, but his mind. That evening, as he walked home, the city felt slightly different. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged. But inside, a realization grew stronger with every step. Those early mornings were no longer just personal discipline. They were quietly reshaping his future. And this small moment would not remain the only one. Because once the world sees what you're capable of, new doors begin to appear where there were none before. And the man was about to discover just how far those quiet mornings could take him. Months passed, and the man's mornings continued to unfold the same way. The quiet alarm before sunrise. The small lamp lighting the room while the city still slept. Pages turning slowly, ideas settling into his mind. What once felt unusual had now become part of who he was. But while the routine stayed simple, the results around him began to grow. At work, he was no longer just another pair of hands. People started noticing how he approached problems. His supervisors trusted him with responsibilities that once seemed far beyond his role. And little by little, his position began to change. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There was no dramatic moment where everything suddenly shifted. Instead, it unfolded gradually, like sunrise spreading across the sky. First, a small promotion. Then opportunities to learn new skills others hadn't taken the time to develop. What truly changed, though, was the way people saw him. Co-workers began asking for his advice. Managers invited him into conversations where decisions were made. The quiet man who once blended into the background was now someone others relied on. But the greatest transformation happened inside him. The doubts that once filled his nights had slowly disappeared. In their place grew a steady confidence built on knowledge and effort. He no longer felt trapped by circumstances. He understood that growth was something he could create. His life didn't become perfect. Challenges still appeared, and difficult days still arrived. But now he faced them with a different mindset. Problems were no longer walls blocking his path. They were puzzles waiting for someone patient enough to solve them. Years later, people sometimes asked how his life had changed so much. They expected a complicated answer, some secret strategy or rare opportunity. But the truth was surprisingly simple. It started with a quiet habit most people overlook, a decision to use the early hours of the day to grow his mind. And what began as a small personal experiment had slowly rewritten the direction of his entire future. If you look closely at the man's story, you'll notice something important. His life didn't change because of a miracle. No sudden fortune appeared, and no powerful person stepped in to rescue him. The real turning point was much quieter than that. It was a decision about how to use a single hour of his day. Most people underestimate the power of quiet time. Those early morning moments, when the world is still calm and distractions are asleep, hold a kind of hidden potential. An hour of scrolling disappears quickly, but an hour of focused learning can reshape the way a person thinks. Think about it for a second. What could happen if you studied something valuable every morning? Not for 5 hours, not perfectly, just consistently. 30 minutes learning a new skill. 20 pages of a good book before your day truly begins. Imagine doing that for 1 month, then 3 months, then a full year. The difference between the person you are today and the person you could become would be extraordinary. Knowledge compounds in ways people rarely notice at first. One idea leads to another. One skill opens the door to a new opportunity, and slowly the future begins to widen in front of you, just like it did for the man in this story. But here's the part most people miss. The world rarely rewards effort immediately. Often the most important work happens when no one is watching. In quiet rooms, early mornings, and patient repetition. That's where transformation truly begins. So the question becomes personal now. What are you doing with the quiet hours of your day? Are they slipping away unnoticed? Or are they slowly building the person you want to become? Because somewhere, tomorrow morning will arrive again, and in that quiet moment before the world wakes up, a new chapter of someone's life will begin.